I read and watched Gone with the Wind as an adolescent, I remember being really struck by the scene at the very end when Rhett Butler is basically telling Scarlett O'Hara off after years and years of having loved her, and he finally says, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn."
Red, you go. Where shall I go? What shall I do?
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
It was the most frustrating scene for me to watch because having seen how much he pined after Scarlett all those years, how much he loved her, how many times he was rejected by her, we wanted that conclusion of finally having a happy ever after when she reciprocates his feelings. But by the time she realized that she had taken him for granted and that she had placed her love in false places, it was too late. He had already reached the point of no return. Rhett Butler had loved her for so many years, he had been rejected by her for so many years, the two of them had gone through suffering together, like the loss of their child, but he simply could not do it anymore. He had reached his tipping point. And that is the topic of today's video, that point of no return in relationships. That line in the sand that is crossed where either one or both people in the relationship just cannot reverse what's been done. A line has been crossed that they cannot undo. It's the point at which resentment has built up too high, things have been said that are too cruel, and contempt has reached a peak that is incompatible with mutual respect. So today we're going to talk about several different ways that I think people reach this point in relationships. When one person reaches the threshold of how much disrespect they're willing to tolerate, when one person hurts the other in a way that can never be undone, when resentment has built up too high, contempt, and the ick. Hi, I'm Dr. Anna Uden. I'm a postdoctoral therapist and author, and also just a reminder that if you like works of fiction which explore these types of complex interpersonal dynamics, you might want to check out the novel I published, The Curse in Their Veins. You can find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other places. So let's talk about the first instance when that line has been crossed in a relationship. When one person reaches their threshold for how much disrespect they're willing to tolerate. Every single person, each one of us, has a limit to how much we're willing to stand in a relationship. Some of us had lower limits, some of us have higher limits, but we all have a limit. There are those who have a very low threshold of what they're willing to tolerate. These are the people that typically end a relationship as soon as something goes wrong or a betrayal happens or a red flag occurs. And then there are those that tend to make justifications or excuses for people, who want to believe the best in the other person, or who maybe doesn't think they deserve to end a relationship early on, and for some reason they have a higher threshold of what they're willing to tolerate. But in both of those cases, everyone has a threshold. There's no one that has no threshold of what they're willing to tolerate. And even the people that stay in deeply harmful and unhealthy relationships for months and years and even decades, those people have a limit too. Everyone has a tipping point at which they decide enough's enough. You have to understand that there are only so many times you can be cruel or mean or disrespectful or rude to another person before they get tired of it. Just because they haven't left up until now doesn't mean they never will. And in fact, I would argue that the more that resentment builds up and goes unaddressed, the more that they tolerate, the more likely it is that when they finally do reach that tipping point, it is going to be very reactive and explosive. People that tend to bottle things up, they also tend to snap at some point. In order to avoid conflict, I had this pattern of letting rude behavior go unacknowledged, and unfortunately that meant that the resentment just kept building up and up. And when a person has let one thing too many slide, at that snapping point, it can sometimes feel like I've let you take jab after jab after jab after jab at me, and then the whole anger from all of those jabs comes cascading down as opposed to just one jab reaction. So that's one way that people reach the point of no return in relationships, is by reaching their threshold of how much bullshit they're willing to tolerate. Reason number 2 is when one person hurts the other in a way that cannot ever be undone. The usual way this happens is through betrayal. It's true what they say about betrayal. It's kind of like breaking a piece of glass. You can break a piece of glass and maybe try to glue all the pieces back together, but it's never going to look quite exactly like it did before. Or another example of this is when someone makes a mistake so big and so irreversible that the other person can just never look at them the same way. Like in The Sopranos, when Chris Moltisanti sits on Adriana's dog, or reversibly, when Adriana becomes a snitch for the feds, Chris Moltisanti can never look at her the same way. There are these huge marker events in people's relationships that mark a before and an after point. There's this French movie with Monica Bellucci and Vincent Cassel called Irreversible that perfectly encapsulates how some things are so incredibly horrific and traumatic that they can never be undone. There is no way to ever go back to the way things were. I would not recommend that movie. By the way, it is incredibly violent and horrific, even though Monica Bellucci looks gorgeous in it. It's honestly one of the most unnecessarily gruesome movies I've ever watched. Again, cannot emphasize this enough, would not recommend you watch it. Reason number 3 is that the resentment has built up too high. We've talked on this channel before about gridlocks, where in a relationship, and especially in couples, when two people have incompatible needs, most of them don't get resolved. Because if they had a solution, you would have already found it. But a lot of relationships don't have solutions to their problems. And so people just end up having the same conflict over and over and over again. And we talked in that video about some workarounds for this, like working together against the problem, externalizing the problem rather than treating each other like the problem. But there are some times when an incompatibility in a relationship results in one party's or both just getting so damn fed up. There's only so long that a person can go without having their needs met. For example, a very common and very gendered example is the mental load. The mental load, if you don't know about it, is how typically women take on these mental tasks and like planning and reminders. It's this very intangible, diffuse sense of responsibility for things, or else they don't get done. And in a lot of heterosexual relationships, that's what ends up happening. The woman takes on the mental load and she builds up this resentment because the man is not sharing the mental load. Or maybe it's an emotional need that isn't being met. Maybe one person is really, really bad at texting and the other needs those moments of reassurance and checking in throughout the week. And one person is just not able to meet the other person's needs for whatever reason. By the time you're finally ready to make a compromise, it could be that the person in the relationship with you is not even interested anymore. They've reached, again, a sort of threshold for how much they're willing to tolerate, and in this case, a threshold of resentment. Reason number 4 why a person could reach the point of no return in relationships is contempt. Contempt is one of John Gottman's 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. If you don't know John Gottman's research on couples, he found the 4 biggest predictors of short-term divorce, and he also found that the biggest out of those 4 was contempt. I do have a video that goes into this more in depth if you want to check it out. But contempt is when one person basically feels superior to the other. They think that they are so much better and that their partner is not respectable or inferior to them in some way. Respect and contempt are by definition opposites. And since you cannot have a healthy relationship without respect, you cannot have a healthy relationship with contempt. Unfortunately, it is an element of relationships that I see often, especially when people get into very maladaptive arguments. There is a lot of contempt that gets displayed. I feel like contempt is one of the fastest ways to get to that point of no return. You want to end a relationship, make it very clear to your partner that you do not respect them, that you think you're better than them, say all these cruel, mean things. Obviously, don't do these things. I'm not actually saying to do these things. I'm saying that's the fastest way you're going to ruin your relationship. In the beginning stages of relationships, people are just nicer to each other. They're kinder, they're appreciative, they admire their partner, they're attracted to their partner. And then over time, as that idealization starts to fade, for a lot of people who don't put in the work to stay in that honeymoon phase, the more they start to take jabs at each other, the more contempt starts to trickle in during moments of conflict or during moments that you're fine. It could be simple, like making a really bad joke at your partner's expense just in a moment of levity. Sometimes those jabs that people take at each other can be so unbelievably cruel and mean-spirited that the person hearing them has no way of undoing what they've just heard. They've just heard such a gross expression of contempt towards them. They've just heard that the other person doesn't respect them, that of course it would instantly cause a shift in the relationship. That shift, in my opinion, is the point of no return. I feel like we've seen this in movies. I can't think of an example at the top of my head. Definitely seen it in real life relationships too. It's very unfortunate that people sometimes get to that point once they get complacent in relationships. And reason number 5 why someone could reach that point of no return is what's often called the ick. To me, the ick is an interesting expression and kind of a funny one because it reflects this cultural collective understanding that respect and attraction are integral to romantic relationships. I feel like I've kind of comprised a formula of what the ick is. To me, the ick is comprised of 2 ingredients: disgust and loss of respect. Loss of respect is usually brought on by some sort of glaring and major value discordancy between people. Let's say that one person really values hard work and they start to notice that this person that they're friends with is very, very lazy. They might kind of get the ick for that person. And disgust is also self-explanatory. I feel like it can often be a byproduct of the loss of respect itself, but it can also be caused by other factors like not putting in the work, getting complacent in the relationship, not taking care of yourself. In a way, I feel like the ick is actually very adaptive for people because it takes away that conscious decision of choosing to end a relationship. When someone gets the ick, it feels as instinctive of an emotional reaction as when someone gags. This morning, my cat puked, and as I was watching my husband cleaning up, I was physically gagging because it was so disgusting. And it's a very visceral reaction that obviously no one is choosing to gag in that situation. Your body is choosing it for you. The ick is a metaphorical gag. The ick is your body or your unconscious's way of saying basically, this is not the person for you. You do not have compatible values. You are not attracted to this person. It's taking the decision out of your hands. It's not saying, oh, let me give you a few weeks or a few months or a few years to decide if you want to end this. It's saying, this person, you want to get as far away from them as possible. And it's not usually something big. It's often something very unpredictable. And like I said, it usually reflects a value discordancy. The ick is your body's way of saying this person's values are ultimately incompatible with your own. So what are the takeaways? What can we learn from some of these ways of reaching the point of no return in relationships? How can you use this information to help your relationships? To avoid the point of no return in relationships, you might want to not take people for granted. Be wary of crossing those very big deal breakers or betrayals that can never be undone. Listen to other people's needs before the resentment gets far too high. Foster a culture of respect and appreciation rather than contempt. Don't say really cruel things in the heat of the moment or don't take jabs at people. And don't get complacent in relationships. Make sure that the other person maintains respect and attraction for you. So tell me, have you ever experienced any of these in your relationships? If so, I would love to read about it in the comments. Take care.